Well, we're back again. My name is Marty Scott again, and I am our Global Outreach Pastor and Fellows Program Pastor. And I'm excited to go through the next lesson of Philippians with you. I really enjoyed walking through 1 through 11, and so apparently I'm now walking through 12 through 26 with you as well. We will be looking at Lesson 2, as you know, which is focused on Philippians 1, 12 through 26. Philippians 1, 12 through 26. Last week, we covered 1 through 11, which is kind of Paul's intro to the letter. This is a letter focused on Paul's relationship with the Philippians church, and he's talking through their partnership in the gospel. He's showing them his appreciation for how they've partnered with him, and he's going to exhort them about what it looks like for them to continue in that partnership and to continue to see the progress of the gospel. This week, we're going to look maybe more specifically at what the progress of the gospel has looked like for Paul in his present circumstances. That, I think, is a large kind of key word or idea, for me at least, when I read this passage, is circumstances. So when I guess if you open up the packet, your first thing is you have the passage and you have your observations that you need to list out. And in verse 12, I made sure I kind of boxed. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. So we have the greater progress of the gospel, and he's going to expand on what that looks like. But you have this key word here that is his circumstances. Circumstances are going to become a little bit of what he's going to walk people through here and as we come back at the end of Philippians. And I think I kind of previewed or discussed that a little bit last week, but as I circled circumstances in verse 12, I just kind of wrote a note in there that I think it reflects forward, or at least when we get to chapter 4, it's going to reflect backwards to Paul talking about in chapter 4, verse 11 through 12. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I've learned in whatever situation or circumstances that I am in, I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Paul is able to be content in any circumstances because he is aligning himself with God's plan and God's kingdom, and his focus is on the progress of the gospel in all of those situations. Whether he is in need or has plenty, whether he's hungry or filled, the progress of the gospel is what matters to him, and therefore it is greater than whatever circumstances he's in. That's where he's going to end this letter at, and he's going to start kind of this body of the letter here as well, because he's going to present them with the very specific circumstance he's in and rejoice that even though it's relatively terrible circumstances, he's in jail, he can rejoice at the progress of the gospel, that it is moving forward through the guard, and that it's encouraging and motivating the church to make it known. And I think we see that in one of the interpretive questions. So I, again, circled through circumstances because then later on, you have his circumstance in verse 12, and then he's going to also kind of expand on what circumstances are, as we'll see. I think rejoice continues to be a key word because what he's doing is rejoicing in whatever circumstances he's in. He's content and he rejoices. And it's because he can rest in what God is doing. And then you have a lot of themes in the second half of this passage on life and death. So we are going to move through the observation skills here, or not really focus in on them. I'd encourage you, obviously, to kind of make sure you hit on these as you're going through it. List out any interpretive questions that you have. Probably most of the interpretive questions are going to be surrounding the questions in the interpretive section. So what we are going to do is zoom in or turn the page and look at some of our interpretive questions here. The first one, answer two of your own interpreter questions. We'll move past that one because I think we'll hit a lot of them as we go through the passage. The question two, how does this passage relate back to 1:11? Specifically, why does Paul feel the need to assure the Philippians of the gospel's progress here in this passage? So these first 12 through, my Bible divides it out 12 through 18 and then starts a new section in 19. This 12 through 18 is going to zoom in on his specific circumstances that he is in. And so he's probably doing a few things. First, he is setting an example of the gospel's progress. So he is looking at, in the midst of his circumstances, here are all the different ways that the gospel is progressing and how God is using these circumstances to make his glory known, to make his name known. And so it could be, you could look at it as kind of an update of their partnership in the gospel. As you partner with me in the gospel, know that something is happening. Okay, you're sending money, you're sending people to encourage, you're engaged in this, and this is what your engagement is bringing. The gospel is being made known despite me being, in spite of me being imprisoned. And so he's going to encourage them about that. And then we also talked last week, I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ. He could be reflecting back on that idea too, that this good work of Paul making the gospel known in all of these different places, and him just being a minister of the gospel, that God is bringing that to completion. And so I think there is a little bit of a theme here of God is at work. God is moving and God is doing things, and Paul is able to participate in that. God is doing something in Rome with these guards, and Paul's the vessel that God is choosing to use here. But again, God is going to complete this good work that he began with Paul. And so again, reflecting back to this idea of the good work is some sanctification, some their participation in the gospel, their engagement in making the gospel known, and how those two things go together. I kind of wrote out one, you see an example of the gospel's progress. And the second thing is you see an example of Paul's priorities and values here. So he's going to begin to build priority and value statements. His priority and his value is not whether or not he's in jail. He probably cares whether he's in jail or not. He probably cares whether he has food or not. But I think that those cares pale in comparison to the progress of the gospel in Paul's life, that he values the progress of the gospel. He values knowing Christ and making Christ known, as we're going to see in chapter 3. He values that so much more than anything else that his imprisonment doesn't matter. And he's building an argument for that the gospel is our highest priority. It is his highest value. Knowing Christ and making Christ known is central to who he is, and his circumstances are secondary, maybe, but the gospel is his priority. And so you're going to see, one, God is at work and we step into his work, and two, the progress of the gospel is more important than circumstances. And I think that is largely what he is. This whole passage is going to be focused on that, whether it's this section talking about being a prisoner or the next section in life and death. Question 3, why can Paul rejoice even when envious and ambitious people are preaching Christ, whether in pretense or in truth? Specifically, what did Paul likely believe about God and his word? First off, I think a little bit of the question should be just, what is the situation? We don't have necessarily a really clear picture of the situation and circumstances that Paul is referencing here. We know that he's in prison and he's in Rome. So it seems like there's some believers in Rome that are preaching Christ out of envious and ambitious motives. And so we can only really guess at what this looks like. As I read this, it really reminds me a lot of 1 Corinthians and the 1 Corinthians church. And in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul is going to talk about in 10 through 17. He talks about the quarreling in 11. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified to you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. And then he kind of is like, I don't remember who else I baptized. But the point is that there were these divisions in Corinth. He's going to refer to this again in 1:3, referring to between him and Apollos. So 1:3-5. Some say, I follow Paul, another, I follow Apollos. Are you not merely human, being merely human? So that's 1 Corinthians 3:4-5. That there were people that were kind of gathering followers around them, and that they had these disciples, and that there was this pride over who you were following. Even though, they were probably all following Christ on some level, there was this pride over who their teacher was or who their pastor was. I mean, I don't know. In modern terms, the best I could do is maybe say, like, if a bunch of you are like, I go to Southwood, and some other people are like, well, I go to Anderson, and it was the first one. And then the Midtown people chime in, and they're like, well, I don't know if you know, but we go to Midtown, and it's right across the street from where the actual original one was. If we actually started quarreling over what campus we go to, that could be similar to at least what the situation was on some level. It could be stretching it in 1 Corinthians. And then I zoom in on this passage in Philippians, and there could be this sense of, okay, you have a church in Rome that is growing, and you have some leaders in Rome that are pastoring and that are elders and that are leading this church, and all of a sudden Paul shows up. And all your people are going to be like, whoa, look, Paul's over there. Let's go talk to Paul, and let's listen to Paul, and let's hear from what Paul says. And for those leaders, all of a sudden, it seems like maybe some of their spiritual authority in these people's lives is being cut out. Paul's probably not intending to do something like that. But nevertheless, those leaders could maybe feel that way. And so what they're doing is they're trying to be like, well, look what we're doing, and going and preaching Christ with extra energy and more vigorously, so that people begin to notice that and look to them. Again, I'm just kind of spitballing as to what this situation could look like, but we don't need to know the exact situation so much as to know, like, okay, there are circumstances for what this could look like. And what Paul is going to look at in this is say, look, praise God that Christ is being proclaimed. And if these people are motivated because I'm here, and that's why they're going and making Christ known a whole bunch, well, you know what? God's going to use that. God is going to use that. And that is the truth, I think, that Paul is really building upon in these verses, is God is going to use that. In this situation, God is going to use that to make him known. And I don't have to worry about what their motives are. I'm going to keep proclaiming here. I'm going to keep preaching here. And God will deal with that. God will use that, work in that, or deal with that. And so Paul can rest in that. But also he's confident God's going to use it. And I think that especially the Isaiah 55:11 is this idea that the word's going to go out and God's going to use it, and God's going to make something happen with it there. God will use the word being preached in spite of motives. It's kind of the line that I wrote out there. That's number 3. Number 4, what kind of salvation is Paul referring to in verse 19? Keep in mind, it is translated as deliverance here in the NASB, but it is usually translated salvation elsewhere. What different range of meanings can this word have in the New Testament? This is actually, in some ways, a preview of a future, I don't know which lesson it's going to be, in a future interpretive skill that we're going to look at, where we list out all the options and then kind of think through which one is best. First off, again, there's a little bit of a transition here where Paul is going to shift from his current circumstances in prison to looking kind of forward to what's next for him. And he's really weighing what's next over, well, there's death or there's life. And with death, I get to be with Christ. With life, I continue to make the gospel known. I continue to be a part of what God's doing to progress the gospel in his kingdom. And he's going to look at both of those. And he might say one's better. He's actually like, death's better. I get to be with Christ. But he's going to show like both of these are good. And there's this contentment. Again, this contentment of circumstances. So that's going to be this next section, verses 19 through 26. So looking at number 4 then, the word here, deliverance, is soteria, which is salvation generally. Well, it can be translated salvation or deliverance. So here a lot of them translated deliverance. Depending on what commentary you look at, you're going to get generally what I found 4 different options for what deliverance or salvation here is referring to. I'm going to walk us through each of the 4, kind of where it comes from, and probably you'll see what I land on. Maybe. We'll see. So the first one that I put is deliverance from present circumstances. So Paul says, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or death. So deliverance from present circumstances. There are really 2 possible present circumstances that this could be referring to. One is his imprisonment. So this is a popular option for this one, and probably why, like the ESV, the NAS, I think the NET all interpret this, or not interpret, they translate this as deliverance, is because he's just talked about his imprisonment, and now he's talking about deliverance. And so they look at, okay, he's praying to be delivered from his imprisonment. So that's one option. The second option would be deliverance from present circumstances, that being his physical body. So what he's going to look at next is life and death, and maybe he's ready to be done, physically just spent. As he's going to say in 2 Timothy, he's poured out. He's gone through it all, and he's ready to be done. And so there's some views that say deliverance from his physical body. These are both legitimate options. I personally, again, I've kind of been building an argument that Paul's circumstances don't really matter to him, but it's the progress of the gospel. And so I'm not sure he would be saying like, hey, church, please pray for my deliverance from these circumstances after I just told you I rejoice in these circumstances. But both are in the net. If you look at the Net Bible's notes, both of their 2 options are that, essentially. Deliverance from present circumstances or physical body. The next option is deliverance. It is a continuation of the last, the beginning of chapter 1, where he says, like we looked at last week, and I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus. That he is looking back to that section, and he's thinking through this good work being completed, that he wants them to pray for the completion of his salvation, that God would complete this good work in him, and that the Philippians church would be engaged in prayer for that. And then the third option fourth option, is deliverance from not making Christ known, or Christ not being honored in his body. This is, if you asked me and said, hey, you need to have a stance on this. This is where I would land. I don't know if there's like an official Grace Bible Church stance or not. Since I'm the one doing the video, maybe this is it. I don't know. But for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. Verse 20, in my mind, is the key to my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope. It is his deepest desire here that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or death. As Paul contemplates life and death and imprisonment, his deepest desire is that Christ would not be put to shame, but that he would continue to be motivated by the gospel and making Christ known, and that when he faces death or whether he faces life, he would do it in a way that brings honor and glory to Christ. And his desire is that the church would pray that he would do that he would honor and glorify Christ as he faces these different circumstances, and that he would be delivered from the possibility of Christ not being honored in his body as he is imprisoned. And so I think that again is his view as he's asking for prayer for deliverance. It's there is this chance that he could not fall away, but that he could just desire to not die or desire to die, and he wants to do what brings God the most glory, and that's the deliverance, I think, in this passage. While there's one interpretive skill that says write out all the options, there's another interpretive skill somewhere that's going to say go consult a commentary, and if you start consulting the commentaries, the deliverance from not making Christ known, the one that I just explained as point 4, is like a footnote in Constables, and that's all I've seen. So it's not maybe the most popular view, but it's the one I like the most. So all 4 of these, I think there's a possibility of all of them. And that's kind of where I'm at. So I hope that was enough of an answer. And that leads to question 5. What is Paul's perspective on life and death? Furthermore, how does this differ from our contemporary culture's view on these same 2 topics? Paul's view, this is, again, I told you last week, don't just brush over these passages and these verses, because it is life-changing. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet, which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard-pressed between the 2. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. What an incredible perspective to have, for that is far better. I was teaching through John on Monday with our fellows, and we ran into John 11:25, where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And we were talking about what that means. And it means that Jesus conquered death, and that death is no longer final. Death is no longer final. Death has become circumstantial. And so Paul has this perspective and this mindset that whether he lives or whether he dies, these are 2 circumstances in which he is in God's will. Whether it's making Christ known or being with Christ, both of those are in God's will and a part of God's story for Paul. And so he can praise God and he can be content with whichever one he goes to. But death has become circumstantial and not final for Paul. And that is because Jesus Christ is the resurrection and the life. That's Paul's perspective on life and death. How does this differ? I think that's a great question for y'all to talk through about, hey, how do each of you view death? What is your perspective on death? Are you ready for it? What an incredible opportunity to hear how people feel about death and clarify the gospel at this point, and help them to see what the gospel is and that they can be ready and that death can be circumstantial. So you can kind of engage in that conversation with them. Besides that, spend a lot of time on that. This is such a powerful passage to be able to engage in death and life and what it looks like to truly have a perspective that death is not final, and that it is, even as Paul's going to say, better because you get to be with Christ. I want to specifically, as we get it into Make It Real in the application section, specifically point out the Engage tool. So the Engage tool last week, and I think this week, you're looking at an Every Neighbor map. And this is thinking through who are the people that God has put in your proximity that you can engage in the gospel. And what I love about the Every Neighbor map being right here is it ties in so beautifully with Paul's perspective. Paul, he is convinced that he is not going to die, that he is not going to be with Christ, even though that is better, because God still has a mission for him. If I am to live, that means fruitful labor. And he's going to say, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. Paul's convinced that there's still a mission before him to make known. And so what he's saying is, look, I'm here, I'm alive, and so that God has something for me to do. And the question that you're engaging with as you're working through your Every Neighbor map is, God has a gospel mission for you. And I am certain of that because you're here. You're here. You're not with Christ. Therefore, God has a gospel mission for you. Who is it? What is it? What is that relationship that God has ordained and put in front of you for you to engage in for the progress of the gospel? And as you map out your Every Neighbor map, and as you ask your group to hold you accountable for those relationships, this is what you're engaging in, is God has a gospel mission for you. And we're certain of that because you're still here. So who is that? What is that? And how are you going to engage that mission this week? Thank you. Again, if you have any questions, I would love to interact with you on it. You can email me at martyscott@grace-bible.org, and I'd love to answer any questions that you might have or get any feedback you might have on this as well. Appreciate it, and I hope you have a great week. And, I'm looking at a storm hitting here tonight, so I hope you all stay warm as well. Have a good one.